Well, it's a great pleasure to be here, and of course a lot of us know each other already, and I'm looking forward to meeting the rest of you. I want to talk today about one of my particular heroes, Wilfrid Sellars, and I want to place the arguments of his masterwork, Empiricism and the Philosophy of Mind, into a slightly larger context by tracing further into some of the neighboring works, some strands of argumentation that intersect and are woven together in his critique of empiricism in its two principal then extant forms, traditional empiricism and 20th century logical empiricism. Sellars always accepted that observation reports resulting non-inferentially from the exercise of perceptual language entry capacities play both the privileged epistemological role of being the ultimate court of appeal for the justification of empirical knowledge claims, and therefore, given his inferentialist semantics, an essential semantic role in determining the contents of the empirical concepts that we apply in such judgments. But in accord with Sellars' stated ambition to move analytic philosophy from its Humean into its Kantian phase, he was severely and in principle critical of empiricist ambitions and programs in epistemology and especially in semantics that go beyond that minimal, carefully circumscribed characterization of the cognitive significance of sense experience. Indeed, I think a good bit of the lasting philosophical interest of Sellars' thought lies primarily in the battery of original considerations and arguments that he brings to bear against all weightier forms of empiricism. Some, but not all of those, are deployed in the opening critical sections of Empiricism and the Philosophy of Mind, where the ground is cleared and prepared for the constructive theorizing that occupies the second half of that essay. But what's on offer there, I want to claim, is only part of Sellars' overall critique of empiricism. And we accordingly court misunderstanding of what is there if we don't appreciate the shape of the larger enterprise to which it contributes. In an autobiographical sketch, Sellars dates his break with traditional empiricism to his Oxford days in the 1930s. That break was, he says, prompted by concern with understanding the sort of conceptual content that ought to be associated with the logical, causal, and deontological modalities. Already at that point, he says, he had the idea that, quote, what was needed was a functional theory of concepts, which would make their role in reasoning, rather than their supposed origin in experience, their primary feature, end of the quote. This telling passage introduces two of the master ideas that shape Sellars' critique of empiricism. The first is that a key criterion of adequacy with respect to which the semantics of empiricism will be found wanting concerns its treatment of modal concepts. And the second is that the remedy for this inadequacy lies in an alternative, broadly functional approach to the semantics of those concepts that focuses on their inferential roles, as it were, looking downstream to their subsequent use, as well as upstream to the circumstances that elicit their application. This second, inferential functionalist semantic idea looms large in Empiricism and the Philosophy of Mind. In fact, it provides the raw materials that are assembled and articulated into Sellars' positive account of the semantics of the concepts applied in reporting thoughts and sense impressions. Concern with the significance of modality in the critique of empiricism, however, is almost wholly absent from that work, even though it's evident in articles that Sellars had already written. I don't think that that's because it was not, even then, an essential element of the larger picture of empiricism's failings that Sellars was seeking to convey, but rather because it was the result of a hard-won, but ultimately successful, divide-and-conquer expository strategy. That is, I conjecture that what made it possible for Sellars finally to write Empiricism and the Philosophy of Mind was figuring out a way to articulate the considerations he advances there without having, at the same time, also to explore the issues raised by empiricism's difficulties with modal concepts. Whether or not that conjecture about the intellectual biographical significance of finding a narrative path that makes possible the separation of these aspects of his project is correct, I want to claim that it's important to understand what goes on in EPM in light of the fuller picture of the expressive impoverishment of empiricism that becomes visible when we consider what Sellars says when he does turn his attention to the semantics of modality. There's a third strand to the rope with which Sellars first binds and then ultimately strangles the excessive ambitions of empiricism. That's his methodological strategy of considering semantic relations among the meanings expressed by different sorts of vocabulary that result from pragmatic dependencies relating the practices one must engage in or the abilities one must exercise in order to count as using those bits of vocabulary to express those meanings. I'm going to call this the pragmatist element in Sellars' multi-front assault on empiricism. It makes a significant contribution to the early critical portion of EPM, though Sellars does not overtly mark it, as he does the contribution of his inferential functionalism to the later constructive portion. The concern with what one must do in order to say, and so to think, various kinds of things remains implicit in what Sellars does, rather than explicit in what he says about what he does. But as we will see, both the pragmatist and the inferentialist ideas are integral to his critique of empiricist approaches to modality and to his constructive suggestions for a more adequate treatment of modal vocabulary. I think of the classical project of analytic philosophy in the 20th century as being the exploration of how the meanings expressed by some target vocabularies can be exhibited as, in some sense, a logical elaboration of the meanings already expressed by some base vocabularies. The conception of the desired semantic relation between the vocabularies, the sense of analysis, varied significantly within this broadly defined semantic project, including such species as definition, paraphrase, translation, reduction in various senses, supervenience, and truth-making, to name just a few prominent candidates. The distinctively 20th century form of empiricism can be understood as one of the core programs of this analytic project. Not in the sense that every participant in the project endorsed some version of empiricism, but in the sense that even those who rejected it for some target vocabulary, or who took the possibility of an empiricist analysis to be did take the possibility of an empiricist analysis to be an important issue, to set at least a legitimate philosophical agenda. Construed in these terms, 20th century empiricism can be thought of as having proposed three broad kinds of empiricist base vocabularies. The most restrictive kind comprises phenomenalist vocabularies, those that specify how things subjectively appear as opposed to how they objectively are, or the not yet conceptualized perceptual experiences that subjects have, or the so far uninterpreted sensory given, the data of sensation, sense data. A somewhat less restrictive genus of empiricist-based vocabularies limits them to those that express secondary qualities, thought of as what is directly perceived in some somewhat less demanding sense. And a still more relaxed version of empiricism restricts its base vocabulary to the observational vocabulary deployed in non-inferentially elicited perceptual reports of observable states of affairs. Typical target vocabularies for the first phenomenalist class of empiricist-based vocabularies include those expressing empirical claims about how things really or objectively are, that is, those expressing the applicability of objective empirical concepts. And typical target vocabularies for the observational vocabulary empiricism include theoretical vocabulary. All the species of empiricism, I think, are concerned with the possibility of underwriting a semantics for modal vocabulary that's used to express laws of nature, and for probabilistic vocabulary, normative vocabulary, and other sophisticated vocabularies of independent philosophical interest. The standard empiricist alternatives are